Hello, my name is Traci Zaretzka. For my thesis project, I wrote and illustrated a children's picture book. But before I share that with you, I want to share a little bit about what got me to this place and the decision to pursue my MFA in the visual narrative program. This is page 1 of what I think is the first picture book I wrote. I was about 9 or 10 at the time. It didn't have a cover, and there's not much of a setting. At this point, my writing skills were better than my illustration skills. I wish I could say I knew at that point that I wanted to write and illustrate children's books, but my path was not quite that simple. Like most children, I did enjoy drawing. I even had one of my drawings printed in a local newspaper. But art wasn't encouraged very much at home, and there was no real art instruction at school, so over time I just kind of stopped drawing and focused more on writing. And it wasn't until high school that my interest in art was renewed. My family didn't go to museums much, so a high school field trip to an Impressionist art museum really was an eye-opening experience, and I just fell in love with the artwork and the painting style. Soon after that, I signed up for my first art class. This is one of a few drawings from that class. Okay, not too bad after having only one semester of art instruction. But that one semester made me really want to learn more about art. So I decided to major in fine art in college. Like many large universities, the art program I was in was more conceptual rather than skills-based. So a lot of my drawing and painting skills had to be self-taught. I was very ambitious back then and decided I would teach myself how to paint with oil paints. Big learning curve. Most of my first paintings weren't very good, and fortunately I do not have those to share. But over time, I did get better. This is the first painting, first of my college paintings that earned a positive critique. And here's just a couple more kind of show you what my style was back then. In college, we were really encouraged to create art that was going to make a difference. I was asked, how are my flower paintings going to make a difference in the art world? And I didn't really have an answer for that, but I thought, I'm going to reach that. I'll figure it out, and I'm going to make art that makes a difference in the world. Once I was out of school, I realized that art is not something that you can support yourself with very well. So I decided to get my teaching credential. I started teaching full-time and was making art when I had in my spare time, basically. My art went through many styles as I was trying to develop a consistent body of work that I hoped would one day get me into an MFA program. I even tried a little photorealism just as a challenge for myself. Meanwhile, teaching reintroduced me to children's books. I used picture books with my students to introduce concepts. I was surprised at how many picture books I could find to support my curriculum, and my students responded really well to me reading to them as a method of teaching. After a few years, I got what I thought was my dream teaching job, teaching kindergarten through 8th grade art. I continued to use picture books to introduce concepts and artists to my younger students. With slightly older students, we analyzed the illustrations in books. And this is about the time that the idea of writing a children's book started to germinate. But I wondered if I had a story to tell, a story that would make a difference in the world of children's books. Then my daughter was born, and even more picture books entered my life. With her, I began looking at books more critically, trying to figure out what made her gravitate to some more than others. What is it about this book that made it the only book she wanted to hear at bedtime every night for a year? So we still never figured that out. But as I looked at more and more picture books, I did make some observations. More often than not, the protagonist was male. It was hard to find books with strong female characters, something that I wanted my daughter to be exposed to. And it was even harder to find books with diverse characters. I realized the worlds children were seeing in books they read did not look like the world they live in. All of this led me to deciding to pursue my MFA with a focus on writing and illustrating children's picture books. My first big project in the program was an oversized picture book titled Rosie's Big Adventures. It's the story of a little red cow who lives in a library and decides one day she wants to explore the city. Up until this point, my primary medium had remained oil painting, but because I came to New York from California for the summer for this program, I didn't have my oil paints with me. So I had to decide on a different medium. I decided to do pencil drawings combined with collage for this project. Both of the characters in the story were female, but that was about the only issue of diversity that I thought about with this project. Instead, it ended up being a fun story about New York City. In hindsight, I was clearly influenced by the fact that I was in New York for only the second time in my life. I think this was me wanting to go out and explore the city. My second project was a digital short story inspired by the unicorn tapestries titled Unicorn in the Museum. For this story, I wanted to incorporate some art into it because something was really important to me. In this story, a shy young girl named Esme is befriended by the unicorn who steps out of the tapestry into her world. Esme is not adventuresome and prefers to spend her time alone, but the unicorn takes her out of her comfort zone to explore the world of several paintings, to show her that the world can be a beautiful place. For this project, I included the element of art history, something that as an art teacher I thought was very, very important. I think it's important for children to be exposed to the arts. I think they should be exposed to them younger than I was. And I know, as from my years of teaching, that too many schools have had to eliminate or reduce their art programs. So picture books that introduce children to art may be the only way some kids can learn about art. For this project, I chose collage again. I wanted there to be texture in my images other than the texture of the tapestry. So I made photocopies of upholstery fabric, which I then cut out to make the clothing on the characters. For the painted parts of the illustration, I used acrylic paint. Though I find acrylic to be a very frustrating medium, I chose it because it dries faster than oil. And for a one-semester project, I didn't have the luxury of giving my illustrations a week or so to dry. All of this led to my thesis project. Looking back at the previous MFA projects I made, I am now able to see how much each one taught me and how much each one contributed to me being able to write Zory's Portraits, a 32-page full-color picture book. A year ago, as I began forming the story for this project, I knew the elements I wanted it to have. I wanted it to be about art. It needed to have a diverse cast of characters, and it needed a strong female protagonist. Meet Zory. She loves art, so she was very excited when she heard that her class was going on a field trip to a portrait museum. At the museum, she and her friends saw a lot of beautiful art. But walking around the museum, Zory noticed something about the portraits that bothered her. All of the portraits were lions and tigers. Where were the zebra portraits? When her teacher told the class to choose a favorite portrait to copy, Zory didn't know what to do. There were a lot of beautiful portraits, but she really wants to copy a portrait that looks like her, and there aren't any. Then she has an idea, but when her classmate Mikey sees what she is doing, he is quick to point out that she is not following the directions. When her teacher asked Zory why she chose to change the face of the portrait she was copying into a zebra, Zory pointed out that there were no portraits that looked like her in the museum, prompting her classmates and her teacher to look more closely at the portraits on the museum wall. Zory's friends decide they want to change their paintings too. Can I make my portrait an emu? Can I make mine a giraffe? I want mine to be a panda. When they were finished with their portraits, they created their own museum at school. Had lots of family come and visit their artwork. So what was Zory's solution to the fact that the portraits in the museum she visited did not show the diversity of her world? She said, I'm making my own museum so people can see portraits with all different kinds of faces. I've learned more in this program than I ever expected to. But most importantly, I realize that I do have stories to tell, and hopefully they will make a positive contribution to the world of children's books. Thank you.
Hi, Traci.
Hi.
So I know that your daughter is a huge influence on you, your life, and your work. Do you often base the success of your work or often test run your work by running it by her first?
I do, and she is actually my toughest critic. We kind of share a space that we call our art studio at home, and so she would often be downstairs with me painting when I was painting. And she'd look over my shoulder and say, "That eye is bigger than that one," or "That's a funny color." So, yes, I do look to her, but I also run the stories by her, because she's a really good test for whether the story is going to be appealing to a child and understood by a child.
Did she understand the themes in it? Or is she still a little young for that?
I think she's a little bit young. For her, she just thought it was really funny that I was putting animal faces on these portraits, because I was using, pictures of the actual paintings to copy. But now I'm not convinced she really understood why I did that.
That was wonderful. I can see all the progression of the kind of your thinking and how you ended up here. And I guess, can you talk a little bit about the process of deciding? It kind of reminds me of what Alex talked about with what animals mean to us and how we give meaning to them and give them personality. But can you tell us a little bit about how diversity and representing each of these animals worked, how that process, how you came to the decision to do it that way?
It was actually an evolving process. When I first came up with the idea, the Zorys class was going to be half human and half animals. And partway through the story, my mentor's wife looked at it and said, "What are you doing here? The people are white and everybody else is animals." And I certainly hadn't seen it that way, but that was how it was being perceived by other people. So I slowly started changing it. First, we just made all the kids animals and left the teacher and the portraits human. And I read that to a couple of classmates in a continuing education class I read, and they said the same thing. It's like, oh, all the white artwork and all the kids are animals. So I was reluctant at first to turn the artwork into animals, but once I did, I had so much fun painting them. So I decided it was a good decision. I limited the number of different animals I used in the painting to contrast how many different kind of animals were in the class.
Great. I think it really works. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on a couple of things here. It was interesting to see the evolution of your art style. You certainly have gone around the block several times looking for a painting style as a fine artist and also as an illustrator, but I think you really hit upon something that is quite beautiful and quite engaging. These gallery scenes with these portraits and these characters were absolutely beautifully painted and also really beautifully orchestrated as pages. Quite lovely. And something else really struck me as you told your story and you got to the point where this character wanted to see herself in the museum. There was a dead silence I felt in here as everybody connected with the drama of that and the importance of seeing yourself in what you do or in your artwork. And it was touching that you had the audience in the palm of your hand like that. It's quite an amazing feat to pull off.
Thank
So
you.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Because I remember the pitch that you gave, and I had the same response back when you gave the pitch. There was that moment where I felt like a lot of people just connected to it and knew what you were trying to do, and there was that aha moment. I remember we talked about that after your pitch was a year ago. So works very well.
Yeah, I think even though the theme isn't so overt that maybe, you know, a 6 or an 8-year-old is going to pick it up, it still has an impact. What you're trying to get across gets across to a young child, and you do that beautifully, you know, using characters that excite them. And, you know, all kids love animals, so you picked like this universal kind of imagery to get this really important message across. I'm curious to know if you have any plans to make Zory into a recurring character who has other stories and adventures and lessons that she's teaching people, or what's next for you?
I do feel like there are more stories that Zory can tell. I mean, she became, in this process, a very well-rounded character with a lot of personality. I've come up with a few ideas. Not sure if I'm going to keep the art as part of it, or, you know, she can branch out. One of my ideas was maybe some of her cousins come to visit, and they're not used to having a teacher who's a lion, you know, and having a cheetah in the class. So kind of showing that maybe not everybody is growing up in that same kind of diverse world that Zory is.
Hi, Tracy. Just from one art teacher to another, I would like to thank you because I think what you point out is really valid, and that art is not as important of a subject. And so I just kind of wanted to know if, while you were making this, if you were thinking about lesson planning or making future stories that involve that can help teachers, like as a tool for children.
As I was working on it, I wasn't thinking of specific lesson plans, but definitely was thinking about how this could be used by art teachers to introduce art, or, you know, by teachers just to start a conversation about diversity. And I think, you know, once we're, you know, wrap up the program, I'm probably going to write up a few lesson plans and put them on my website. I want that to be something that teachers can have access to.
Hi. I was just wondering, like, looking at the work leading up to this, like, as he was saying, like, you did seem to sort of take a long journey with your art style, and I was just wondering about if you could explain a little bit, like, the decisions that were made about, like, transitioning from, like, a more realistic or, you know, I don't know, maybe a more three-dimensional type of art style and into this flatter, more simplistic kind of style, because I definitely think it works for the children's book style, but like maybe you could go a little bit into like what your thought process was with that.
I'm not quite sure what the whole process was. I think with some of my earlier work, I find oil painting to be a really rich medium, and it's easy to make it look very dimensional. This project was done with watercolors, which is a little bit different, so I think that's part of why it doesn't look quite as, you know, as rich. But also with children's books, I didn't want to have so much going on in the pictures that you couldn't follow the story. I tried very much to make sure what was in the illustrations carried the story forward. Hope that answers your question.
Hey, Tracy.
Hi.
I'm over the course of all of this, and I think we're kind of touching upon it in a few questions. But I'm definitely really curious about the path your voice has taken, because I know it was very critical and very seminal to your reasoning to come here, and the work that you've done, and to see that work progress. And I guess kind of bouncing off the last couple of questions, I wonder if you might be able to speak about finding that, because I know that internally, just, you know, being part of all of this, that once that thing happened, like everything really solidified. So I wonder if you might be able to talk about those things that went into it, or when that might have happened, or, you know, kind of how you found your way with this, you know, with this project, because it really has that kind of power and that charm that you've always been after. I've
definitely noticed that in my work too. I can't really say of a specific moment that I knew things changed, but for me, it's when I got more confident in the program that I really felt like I could tell a story. When I first started in the program, I was overwhelmed. I hadn't been in school for a long time. Even though I was teaching art, I hadn't been doing a lot of art, and I certainly hadn't done digital art. So, my very first summer, I see everybody using Photoshop, and I've never used it before. So I came in a little bit nervous and then got overwhelmed, and I think it just took me time to believe in myself and believe that I can produce a story. I can tell a story effectively. That answer your question?
Thank you, Traci.
Hello, my name is Traci Zaretzka. For my thesis project, I wrote and illustrated a children's picture book. But before I share that with you, I want to share a little bit about what got me to this place and the decision to pursue my MFA in the visual narrative program. This is page 1 of what I think is the first picture book I wrote. Thanks. Big learning curve. Most of my first paintings weren't very good, and fortunately I do not have those to share. But over time, I did get better. This is the first painting, first of my college paintings that earned a positive critique. And here's just a couple more kind of show you what my style was back then. In college, and there was no real art instruction at school, so over time I just kind of stopped drawing and focused more on writing. And it wasn't until high school that my interest in art was renewed. My family didn't go to museums much, so a high school field trip to an Impressionist art museum really was an eye-opening experience, and I just fell in love with the artwork and the painting style. Soon after that, I signed up for my first art class. This is one of a few. I was about 9 or 10 at the time. It didn't have a cover, and there's not much of a setting. At this point, my writing skills were better than my illustration skills. I wish I could say I knew at that point that I wanted to write and illustrate children's books, but my path was not quite that simple. Like most children, I did enjoy drawing. I even had one of my drawings printed in a local newspaper. But art wasn't encouraged very much at home. Drawings from that class, not too bad after having only 1 semester of art instruction. But that 1 semester made me really want to learn more about art. So I decided to major in fine art in college. Like many large universities, the art program I was in was more conceptual rather than skills-based. So a lot of my drawing and painting skills had to be self-taught. I was very ambitious back then and decided I would teach myself how to paint with oil paint.